Good evening, good morning, or whatever is the time that you will be watching this lecture. It's my pleasure to welcome Marion Weiss. A couple of footnotes before I do the introduction. One is this is our first in-person lecture in 17 months. So I think it's a wonderful occasion, and I cannot think nobody better than Marion to bring us back to some sense of normalcy in this epidemic. I want to also let you know, Marion, this is not a hostile audience, so the plexiglass have nothing to do because we don't fear for anybody's life. But LA County protocols are very strict, so it was either this or lecture with a mask. We thought this was a little bit better. It's going to be weird because I can see my reflection, so it's going to be one of the most self-conscious lectures that you will do in your life. The good news is you don't get to see the reactions of the people between mask and the reflection, so you can carry on as you see it fit. As I said, it's a true pleasure to have Marion Weiss with us. She's a co-founder and with Manfredi, one of the most interesting and successful practices out there. She's also the Graham Chair Professor of Practice at the University of Pennsylvania in the Weizmann School of Design. Their office is based in New York, and if you're probably familiar with their work. They have been, in the last decade or so, producing remarkable pieces of buildings all over the United States. Currently, they're working in a building here in Lagma, very close. But I think what I think is remarkable about their practice, because I think it touches in a bunch of things that I think they're pretty much present in our everyday discussion. They have to do with the permanent trying to figure it out, the relation between practice, speculation, teaching, and how to operate between that, and what architecture is today, architecture, infrastructure, landscape. And I think Marion, to her practice and her teaching by herself or with her partner, they keep galvanizing that and put it together in a way that is incredibly coherent and fairly unusual. Most of architecture practices usually tend to operate in one territory or another one, but I think the work of Weiss Manfredi has been navigating into this phenomenal, what I would call new ecologies, what architecture could be. So, as I said, I think it's a perfect timing that in many ways this is the first in-person lecture, because I think Marion represents everything that is supposed to be good with architecture and everything we aspire architecture to be. So it is my true honor and pleasure to welcome Marion Weiss to Tsai once again. Thank you for being here.
Hernán, you are right. I see my reflection. And it is indeed an amazing moment to be here as your inaugural post-17 months in-person lecture, but mostly Hernán. Thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. And to all of you at SCI-Arc, I feel like it's great to be back with friends here, because SCI-Arc for me represents a school that has forever been restlessly uncertain about the future and forever scratching in this quarter-mile-long building at what it might be. And that kind of restlessness is something that's very much on my mind now as I think about liftoffs and landings and how we are no longer able to think that we can operate in our own independent territories and think that is complete, because we are clearly, with this pandemic, revealing ourselves to be, and with climate change, forever interdependent. And in fact, it's a time of crisis that we cannot turn our back to. The kind of infrastructural trauma that we're experiencing with climate change, with the fires in California, the floods in Houston and in India, we can start to see that in many ways, and the pandemic being just one more chapter, is something that this is an enduring loop that we continue to experience, and we need to think maybe differently about design. It's not so much polishing the top of the architectural pyramid for that silhouette that is enduring on a magazine cover, but maybe something very, very different. During the pandemic, I lost both of my parents. My father, an aeronautical engineer here in California, first at Lockheed, later on chief engineer for NASA for the space shuttle, was always discussing the elegance and the enduring agony of liftoff and what it takes to get stakeholders to see something in common so that this incredible hunk of something could be hurtled into the sky with clarity and grace. And in fact, he would describe to me the, quote, architecture of what it took to create these liftoffs and landings. And architecture was systems, it wasn't form, but it was thinking about that form that would allow something so unlikely as something as heavy as an airline. And then finally, literally, as something as delicate as a tricycle to come down and land. And it's this liftoffs and landings that I feel is very resonant for today because we have so much to do to lift off again. In fact, it's very interesting when we think 1,000 years ago with the Nazca lines in Peru, that there was this aspirational idea of maybe creating something that could only be understood aerially from above to the gods to create a place for liftoffs and landings. And yet, when you think about our inclination to fortify and button up the barriers and fortifications, that's an enduring impulse that we could certainly have seen in medieval times and later on in Renaissance times, or even in the temporal notions of a work community in Vila Piloto, Três Lagos, Brazil. This need to kind of fortify and keep out the threats and keep your community contained. And yet, we've been far more interested in the temporality that you could see here in Spiral Jetty, that maybe it's an openness, there could be clarity, but there could be an open-endedness that might inform the way we think about design and architecture. And so we've been doing a series of enduring studies with my practice with Michael Manfredi and also with my students, and we've been analyzing elements of infrastructure and architecture and landscape because we feel these are interwoven fields that need to inform each other. And so this is the bridge in Isfahan that you could see that is pretty amazing because it's at once a piece of infrastructure to contain water and collect communities and be temporal in nature. And that's the Kaju Bridge. And then this is the Agrasan Kiboli Stepwell in New Delhi, India. What was once a place where it was actually a retreat, where people could actually spend a night and gather water, is now a place of enduring coolness and gathering, and yet hidden in the earth. Unfolded here, where you could see the places where one might retreat to. And then probably a more familiar one to you, this is the Park Well by Gaudi, which is at once this kind of open-ended idea of clarity and symmetry wandering into an infrastructure that is multi-level to create community and prospect. And so these analytical studies that we've been doing in studios and also internally to look at what their enduring profit might be, we've created with our students a series of models that we were lucky enough that you'll see in a moment to include in the Venice Biennale. But it also informed a book that we wrote not too long ago, which called Public Nature's Evolutionary Infrastructures, which was questioning how social and physical infrastructures might inform and create a new public nature. So we were delighted and honored to be included here in the Venice Biennale. Lines of Movement was our thought. We were asked to reflect on what infrastructure, landscape, and architecture might together, both in our work and in conversation with other more enduring structures, might have in common. And so we chose to create an open-ended, semi-perfect space that people could wander into. And actually, the infrastructure, if you will, was almost building on the kind of nature of containment, again, fortification, so that it could actually travel, ready-made and ready-packed, to become installed, to become a place where we could project the narratives of both our work, but be inspired by and share the work that we continue to be inspired by of these more enduring models. It's our Brooklyn Botanic Garden project, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it's a sense of movement, enduring movement, and actually having the lens to see literally lifting off the edge of what might conceal our understanding of a project. And you could see here with both Piranesi, with the sense of lifting off of the Carcieri series or Giacometti's coming down the stairs, that movement is at stake in everything that we are preoccupied and passionate about. In the Olympic Sculpture Park, in fact, a project we continue to work on, we were there just 2 days ago. It's a project which had an unlikely sort of partnering with the Seattle Art Museum to take 9 acres divided by a highway and train tracks, a contaminated site of Union Oil of California, and a deteriorating seawall and a trolley barn and a 40-foot grade change to turn into a new sculpture park that would be open and free to the public. And it's these unlikely kinds of questions that are far more fascinating than the obvious ones of being given a brief. In fact, the brief here was to green up effectively 3 pieces of land and allow 2 artists to have a commission to do the bridges. But we felt that that would miss the point of actually the simultaneity and resonance of creating something that might be more like an unfolding landform that could wander from the city to the water's edge. Inspired again by my father's thinking and my mother's background in geography and geology, which was the systemic layering should remain vivid and vibrant and vital, and yet it could also inform the architecture here that could equally unfold like the landform to host this community sort of Kunsthal. We were way over budget. I mean, the budget for this project was less than the interior for the Prada store in Manhattan. Let's just leave it there. And so we had to come up with inexpensive systems, and this is highway engineering, MSE, or mechanically stabilized earth, with seismically sort of flexible precast panels that we put up to actually guard and protect it. So 200,000 cubic yards of earth here now wander from the city to the water's edge, luckily acquired nearly for free through an excavation in the downtown museum expansion a mile away. And yet it's this topographically charged precinct could create infinite number of experiences through that sectional change to lift up and above and lift off the highway to finally descend to the water's edge, or in this case, create a valley for Richard Serra's work Wake, create, and you can see our drawings here, the simultaneity of passing under the highway or above as a pedestrian, and literally mark that point of the infrastructure 22 feet below us here at the pedestrian passage, or in fact allow those in the car to visit the park. And yet it's this kind of amplification of the distinction of these directions that would force a view to the mountains, to the port, or in this case, to Amtrak or the BNSF Railway, and actually then introduce and in fact get federal funding here to take what was then a fortified seawall, to take it down, to create a new beach, to create salmon habitat, which you can see right here. So while it looks 100% natural, this is a fully constructed artificial beach for salmon habitat, which they're still continuing to monitor at UW. You can start to see how that was created. That's fish mix in that bench, the failing seawall, which the Army Corps of Engineers said would take about $50 million to restore. We restored for $5 million and created the habitat through this new fortification, in this case, not to leave out, but to invite in. And this is this picture that Iwan Bond took, which really, in many ways, ties it to the landmark of the Seattle Needle, and yet, in our mind, it's really also the salmon below that are as critical as the icon beyond. So you could start to see our preoccupation with our practice has been in many ways not so much blurring boundaries, but amplifying the kind of gifts of landscape and architecture and infrastructure. And with the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, when we interviewed for the project, they identified the visitor center site well in the middle of the parking lot as an entry to move right into the axial cherry esplanade. And our conversation in the interviews, we said, we think you have the wrong site, and with all due respect, you should begin at the urban edge where 40,000 people on Mother's Day line up at the turnstile to enter the garden. And so we looked at the tension between the urban on one edge and the garden on the other, and started to think of what it might be to unfold something that would wander in many ways from being incredibly urban to being incredibly blended, if you will, with the landscape, just beginning with some origami exercises. All urban is dark and all green in the garden, to drag you to the center where they intended the arrival to be. So you could see the copper roofs as they face the city, then twist at a space of light that become a green roof, which is a 10,000 square foot experimental green roof for the garden, creating a point of, in a sense, transition and invitation, and in a sense, choice. Turn left to the city, turn right into the garden. And in this case, while you could say the curves seem natural because they're in a garden, in fact, they're very precise. And this one is just tracking the perimeter of the tree canopy of one of the rarest green flowering cherry trees in all of the East Coast. And so indoor and outdoor, in a sense, are blended, and this is the largest two-sided room that can host a dinner for 260 that has recycled the lost ginkgo that we could not protect and save, kiln-dried to form the back edge of the wall. And in a way, it's the tension between these two worlds, these kind of sectional lifting off to reveal an inhabitable topography that at some moments disappears entirely from our sites. And in other moments, it's that tension between that which is natural and that which is in movement beyond, that is this kind of liminal space between what the garden is, what the building is. And in a sense, it was that topographic question that raised for us the kind of tension between, well, why couldn't we actually go further to Cherry Esplanade, where the site was originally meant to be because it was the only failed slope in the whole garden. And so that led to us helping the garden get a grant from the Robert Wilson Foundation to actually look at this failing place, which had been the original site for the project. And their question was, we've been asked to make the site accessible. And this was the model that was shared with us, that was used throughout the city, particularly at all the stops. And we said, well, yes, we could do a path that would be 360 feet long, but what if we made one that was 600 feet long? Couldn't we create a garden? And so you can start to see what we've done is try to do everything to create a 1 and 3 slope for planting, while creating a kind of mass customization of a precast wall that actually moves in panels that actually follow that slope and create these new precincts for a garden. And so the Robert Wilson Overlook actually finally brings us to the site that they originally intended for the building. Takes you through new landscapes that have been, in a sense, created to not only create the kind of non-deteriorated slope retention, but to create a kind of place of wonder, to create a kind of place, and this is a film, to create a place where literally new natures can come together. So you can see the visitor center beyond, and the city even further beyond. And yet for us, I think the joy is seeing that it's not about making it wheelchair accessible or stroller accessible, but actually adding a new garden that had never existed to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. So this next project is really about sort of opportunities in section. And this one's almost more interior than anything else because it was really about helping the Cornell College of Veterinary Medicine take a jumble of buildings that had been added sort of indifferently, sort of one after another, and to try to give them a sense of being one because of another. And so it was our suggestion to connect the hospital to the research wing and the education wing, where we had to do both some new library, new classrooms, new lecture halls, new convening space, to liberate the landscapes that were hidden and caught as leftover space, to remove 3 buildings, to create a new place that was truly a void rather than a building, to create a connective tissue. So you can start to see the research tower and what had been an addition from the 80s, which we eliminated, to now reclad the research tower, add a new library and a new garden, which is a rain garden, to carve through and create a setting that in many ways, through its openness, its generosity to light, and its looking from one landscape to another, a place where both the hospital, clinical, and research can convene. Now, in many ways, it was about finding the place where detail made sense. And it was this wood ceiling that we were allowed to do in part because of the generosity of a donor sort of biting what we had thought would be far better than sheetrock, which was an acoustical wood, sort of, if you will, a celestial soffit that would open to the clear story that gathers north light. But it's still a high-performing wall. It's acoustically perforated. And it's one that is really allowing the kind of convening spaces, the kind of social spaces, to be both loose fit, specific, but also to be able to host a town hall of 500. And yet it leads us to another project with Cornell, and a shout out here to Tom Main, because he led the way with the Bloomberg Center. And this is a Cornell Tech on Roosevelt Island. Now, Roosevelt Island's a pretty strange and magical place. It's literally an island like Ile de Cité in Paris, as sort of a piece of land in the river that in many ways has river-to-river views, and yet the site that we were given was a sort of an odd shape. You can see the academic building up there, which is Tom Main's, Morphosis Bloomberg Center. And here's what they called corporate co-location. Unfortunate word there, but it was really about bringing startups and academia together. They suggested we put an atrium in the middle and maximize the perimeter. And our thought was that, oh my God, we're on an island. Why not just carve the thing apart and just have the most inefficient circulation space in the middle to take full advantage of this river-to-river view? And yet, we also are in a flood area, so why not elevate the whole experience and start to think about exceeding the FEMA floodline obligations so that we're having a little bit more insurance to the kind of life of the building. And yet, the socialization that they were hoping to have occur between academics and entrepreneurs needed to have this loose-fit circulation area where anything might be happen. So that leads to the construction. And you can start to see a nod here to Tom, shout out, look at that amazing stair on the side that's looking out, and you can start to see our building opening to the green and in dialogue with its solar trellis with the Morphosis building. And yet it's truly about kind of pulling apart what could have been two separate wings into a building now with, instead of 4 sides, 8 sides, and a central gallery that is part landscape and then part interior. And as we go inside, in many ways, a kind of preoccupation with the Spanish Steps kind of shows up here. And yet you can look into the maker spaces and look into the master studio and look up and, in a sense, have a connection just through those visual connections, even if there are, in fact, acoustical separations from all the distinct spaces. And here is a kind of sectional outlay underneath that cantilever for a double-height collaborative studio space. And you'll start to see the trusses have allowed it to be largely column-free, 20% lighter than a typical building that's gravity-bound. And that journey, though, with these stairs is one where that kind of loose-fit idea of connection is one that, in many ways, very few people would say that inefficient buildings are the right thing to do. And yet it was that very inefficiency, including the rooftop deck, that became the place of convening. And you'll see here 22,000 square feet of solar canopy contributing by elevation and being lifted off the roof to create a place that is a place of gathering. And I might add, the contribution of these solar power allowed the Bloomberg building to be the net zero building that is so exemplary. Here you can see the kind of lifting off from the ground and the collaboration with the infrastructure beyond. So what's intriguing, though, is in many ways a chubby building has some narrow points that are quite compelling. And what you can see right here, and I'll just play a brief window into it from the Bloomberg Center, is that very recently, with the pandemic closing out the use of the building to students, it became a great place for the New York City Ballet to take advantage of all these spaces. So you could say that the unscripted possibilities for us were a delight and a surprise when we got this last week, and they shared with us what they were doing with the building until it could be inhabited again. So the next project, Kent State Center for Architecture and Environmental Design, in many ways is quite interesting because when we think of the middle of Ohio, we often think of the factories that actually produce so much of what this country has used. And yet those factories in many ways have, in a sense, lost some of their core efficacy. And so something as simple as building bricks, the kind of creation of bricks, and even these kind of factories and their kind of loose-fit skylit spaces were inspiration for us when we did the Center for Architecture and Environmental Design. In this case, it was taking the simple idea of a loft. You all have a quarter-mile-long loft here, which is exemplary, but recognizing that it had to be multi-story, so how could we, in fact, take that notion of an architecture and environmental design school to keep everybody within eyesight of each other, yet lift off from multiple levels and start to think about how they could unfold. Now, what we were lucky with, we had a tiny budget, but we were able to take the kind of aerial idea of light and yet the magic of the brick and start to think about how we could now allow those two to collide to create this connective tissue between the academic core and the town, which you can see beyond. So it's a place of ascent, a cafe tucked under the stair, the kind of duality of the simple desks, if you will, brought over them from their former studios. And in many ways, the very first day was probably the saddest day ever because it looked so clean. And yet, over time, it's become far more interesting. But what you could start to see, though, is in here, this is the library, which is used for many kinds of things, and with the materials library above, comes down and steps down to a very low level, so it joins the residential scale and the academic scale at the one end of the building. And yet the form of how that has been made took advantage of a factory that had sort of left behind the handmade beehive kiln creation of what could not allow any kind of color control in the bricks we embraced, and said, let's add one more mold to that collection from that beehive kiln, which is this fin, so that we could create something tactile and chromatically diverse that would actually form the skin and create a meter across the studio spaces. And so you can hear the kind of cascading here, the kind of material condition of the brick elevated, the studios above, and the library lifted below. So this idea of kind of liftoff is a preoccupation. You talk about liftoff and landing. It had a different set of requirements at the Singh Center for Nanotechnology at Penn. In this case, we were preoccupied with a couple of things. The whole engineering quad didn't have a speck of landscape, but if you start to think about the city of Philadelphia and even the campus, which over time removed the infrastructure of roads to create ways for a greenscape, it seemed almost an imperative to allow this piece of the campus, the engineering part, to acquire some of that identity that tied it to the city and to the academic core. Now, interestingly enough, nanotechnology is very sensitive science. It's vibration sensitive, it's electromagnetic interference sensitive, and so where the actual labs for clean rooms, microscopy, characterization could go had to be very much away from the EMI sweeps of the trains, of the cars, and of the elevators, in fact. And so the labs had to work around these sweeps of EMI and vibration criteria, and that allowed us, thankfully, a technical reason to enable a garden in the center. And so you could see the gradient from skin to circulation to research lab and landscape simultaneously, again, as my father has spoken about systemic thinking to create very few moves to achieve the greatest amount. And you could start to see that unfolding around this new landscape. And yet you wonder, what's up with the cantilever? The interesting thing about the cantilever is that the only space that had no vibration or EMI criteria in the entire program was the gathering space or forum, where you could convene an entire group of over 100. And so we chose to make that the elective element that would draw attention to this very invisible science of nanotechnology and allow it to be the precipice that would reach over the green and look back to the campus. And the structural requirements of a truss that extends out, over 69 feet looks heroic. It's not. That's actually pretty simple. It's like an IKEA shelf that you might put up on your wall. The real challenge structurally was the suspended void space of the atrium and the semi-gravity bound part below. And so you can start to see the removal of columns to create this liminal space is also looking at what you'd say is this amber portal, if you will, into the clean room itself. That amber glass, typically if you go to a clean room, you just see solid walls and little yellow portals. And we had asked the scientists, what's up with that? Why the yellow? And it was actually the amber that was keeping the infrared rays out. And we said, well, could we just do like a whole wall of it so people could see it? And they couldn't see why not. And we were able to actually start to take that idea to reveal the sciences that were concealed, and yet recognize on the multi-story labs, from our 3 levels of labs, with 20-foot floor-to-floors with our elevators in very remote locations, meant that on our client's part, we needed to create the most irresistible stair that would allow collaboration to happen in this very thin space. And so here you could see the intermediate landings connecting those 20-foot grade changes. And in all cases, to actually connect the community of scientists and engineers, everybody's within eyesight, whether it's a meeting space or a lab or whatever, to get to, now in this case, the forum, which at the very precipice has this kind of collaborative overlook over the campus, or the kind of lining in wood to draw people together. Very simple, intimate space, aerially And in fact, it's got a lot of hard work to do because there's tremendous flooding in Philadelphia. If anybody's walked there after rain, you all know that the streets have a backup system because their infrastructure can't support all the water. And so we have water collection. We have a tank underneath the lawn that's as big as an Olympic-sized pool, a green roof over the infrastructure areas and collaborative areas, and also in the valley below. And yet it's this idea that perhaps it's a simultaneity and the kind of connections between the individuals, the faculty, the students that convene, really try to draw together what the potential and the dream of any academic environment is, which is not only to create places of learning, but hopefully places to inspire. And so we were lucky enough to get this very tiny project, about the size of some of the homes here in Los Angeles, the Tsai Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale University. And in many ways, it came to us because they knew that we would think first about landscape before we would think about the building. And they knew they had a leftover back of all the engineering buildings that had never quite taken the status of being anything close to the Yale quadrangles and courtyards that were so beloved. And in fact, you could see that this is a big paved area behind this kind of fantastic Becton building here. But if you start to see, Breuer's great work, which involved a lot of concrete in some ways, it created enormous barriers between some lovely gardens from the historic collegiate Gothic core, and then the backside here, that's B standing in front of the concrete wall. The problem was they had this great gift that they wanted to be revealed, and yet there was no way to see it. And so we started to think about Magritte, and that the fact that maybe a little glowing light might actually inspire a curiosity to figure out how to get there. And it was just this idea of a light bulb that might inspire, because this is a place for collaborative forums of all the disciplines at Yale to convene. We started to think, well, if we could create something very perfect rather than an addition to one of the buildings, which of course was the brief of the problem was to add to one of the buildings in this quad, and we said if it could be independent, maybe it would be more legible and maybe more unique. We took down the concrete wall, we actually built over some of the labs, and in fact, we're lucky enough to actually work with Fabrica, our glass sort of fabricators here, that by creating enough curvilinearity in this glass, it could be structurally strong enough to support 22-foot vertical spans so we could avoid any horizontal mullions. And so it's that kind of curvature of a kind of studio, which is in many ways, you can see this photograph filled with our staff because of COVID. We can't get the students in there yet. But it's really intended, even with the closed curtain, to become a place that could be forever in motion and forever changing. And even on the upper level with the enclosed kind of meeting areas and breakout spaces, always a sense that you're surrounded by the possibility of invention and change. And what had been that fairly grim space that we had seen without landscape is now a place of an evolving garden, a place that can bring the three generations of buildings, if you will, the collegiate Gothic in the distance, Breuer's Becton on the right. And we like to think that the reflection in our building almost makes Breuer look Gothic, but that's just an aside there. And yet it really is about something as simple as the inspiration of that Magritte moment to say, can it be a light bulb that inspires, which is what is there in place, and we just are so glad students can come to it now this semester. And most recently completed with construction was something that came out of disaster. You all know about the kind of storms that are affecting us, and Hurricane Irma with 185-mile-an-hour winds tore off the kind of skin of the Baker Museum, which in many ways we had done a master plan for Artist Naples, which is their cultural district with performing arts and music and a museum, which we had talked about this project that would lead probably first to a concert hall. And yet, a very strange, formidable world where the museum and even the concert hall said, stay out. This was an opportunity to say, well, maybe it's a moment when it was destroyed and its skin was destroyed, and our client said, let's grow it a little bit to involve maybe a sense of growth, teaching, classrooms, meeting spaces, and music, not only rejuvenate the galleries, but actually expand. And so we had to kind of work around some existing buildings. You start to see these new geometries that we attached to that box of a museum, and you can see it here under construction. And yet it was the recladding that became a kind of reorientation of the building and the decladding of what had been a fairly mausoleum-like, stone fortification that had completely concealed the Paley Gates. And we said, let's let the Paley Gates breathe. And this is an artwork that now marks as a center and arrival. And so what had been that kind of, big formidable glass bubble we removed and created now a place where there could be a place to convene with a kind of water runnel, a quiet sense of light. And the stone, as you will, if you come to the education side, having its own portal or window, a kind of proscenium into now the more active place of rehearsal and performance. So this kind of wandering around the existing, the recladding, and even just the kind of refreshing of their galleries, and the invention of some meeting spaces and a kind of loose-fit rehearsal space that is so acoustically tuned that their orchestra, which plays next door, can rehearse in here and duplicate the acoustic criteria that they have next door. And yet it really was wandering around the existing, the kind of curvature enabling us to make our way around the existing, to extend to the new without touching some of the buildings that needed to stay in place until the master plan could be realized, allowed us to find and discover some geometries that were unexpected in what they would produce. And ultimately creating a place that now during COVID, all the outdoor films and movies with the orchestra on the main hall or even the artworks inside, they've been able to have double screenings here in the courtyard. So this whole idea of how do we fortify ourselves, is security something that we can actually own? Can we protect ourselves? And we were asked by Novartis, a pharmaceutical company with their headquarters, their North American headquarters in East Hanover, to rethink their security gate and maybe recast it as a visitor center. Interesting question. Security was tantamount. As you know, research in pharmaceutical companies can be something that is enormously difficult, but yet important to protect. But how could you make the core of this campus also welcoming? So we started to think about the wall, the barrier, the thing that protects as maybe the thing that could invite you in. And so that question was, could we have a celestial soffit over the land that would bring you through? And could we, in fact, bend and open that wall to change and transform what a gateway might mean? And through that hyper-expression of a celestial soffit and earthwork in a line, maybe create a space where one could enter and be welcomed rather than sense that you're going through that passage of security, and see a liminal space where, in fact, it becomes the enduring gateway now for the pharmaceutical campus to be expressing their intent, which is very hopeful, to be perceived as open and generous as they can be. The interior is interesting. Again, we were lucky to work with Saley Glass to give us structurally no horizontal mullions, big debate. They came in and they're with their German expertise, were able to eliminate the horizontal mullions, again, to get our great vertical span and our columns in the center. And yet you could see the kind of stretch of being an inhabitable topography, which is truly a liminal line, and you can actually see that vertical gate, which you'll see very often in Mexico, and we were inspired by the ones we saw in Mexico City, to catch up the necessary additional 14 feet of protection. And yet protection is really what was at stake to recast and question again the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India. When we were asked to actually both rejuvenate and add to enable this embassy to actually meet its new criteria at nearly its 50-year anniversary, you could start to see Edward Durrell Stone had a vision of a very formal reflecting pool and a great canopy that would, in a sense, host the embassy, very much inspired, as he wrote, by the Taj Mahal. And in fact, if you think about the impact that this embassy had at the time with the idea of contemporary modernism and an incredible engagement with the U.S., it was exciting to see Obama playing basketball next door in the residence there, to start to see what that would mean to take into the next century. So for us, we wanted to go back even further, and we started to look at the Lodi Gardens, the Red Fort, and this incredible marriage of fortification and protection and gardens as a place to celebrate how you might arrive and feel both protected but welcomed and transformed. And if you start to see the dotted areas there, you can see that which was the historic core that we needed to protect, but over 27 acres, there were many other buildings that became one after another, well beyond any master plan that could manage anything other than square footage that was in need. We started to look at the new office building, which is really taking over all the former kind of, main requirements of the embassy, as something that could actually take that idea of landscape and fortification and transform it into a place of welcome while doing the work of security that is so crucial. So you could see this dialogue that we were creating with the existing Edward Railstone canopy-filled, column-lined, if you will, temple, and creating something a little bit more relaxed because it was defined fully by the central garden that would connect campus zones and create a central green that would walk across both precincts and literally try to slalom a notion of connectivity in campus in a place that was really a collection of buildings on the landscape. And that inflection actually inflecting the building form. So from the outside fortification to one that could wander in and host, and again, protect lower levels and upper levels, and a green that could actually come together, that we could actually begin to create a gateway through a garden of a dialogue between the historic now, or sort of the modern historic of Edward Railstone, and our new embassy building in full dialogue. And what you can see here is that that formal round reflecting pool is one that had just been using up an awful lot of water. And so here we're capturing water during the monsoon season, so it's not only an honorific element, but it's also one that's productive to actually provide water when there is none in the grounds when it's very dry. It's a sectional job. We wanted to actually stay on level with the Edward Railstone building, so very much of the program is actually below grade with these carved gardens to draw light into the work areas. So you can start to see this liminal space between the gradients of highly secure spaces to more informal spaces. All of this choreography of fortified walls to create something that is altogether different, in this case, in the embassy gallery space, which is a liminal space between on your left, that which is highly secure, and on your right, that which becomes, in a sense, more welcome because the thresholds have been met. As we looked at the perimeter, too, we were also wanting to make sure that you could look out the window. There was a great screen in the Edward Railstone building, but nobody in the building could actually look out, which was a bit of a concern. And so we started to weave together this language of columns and the kind of jolly screen to create something, maybe a median between those two notions of portal and portus, so that you could actually have the required, if you will, stacking effect that we were so intrigued with, as well as visibility. And so you can start to see here the kind of choreography between the garden, the landscape, those fins that are in many ways these relaxed columns, the canopy and the walls coming together, and ultimately through this now evaporative cooling of your arrival garden, no longer just a formal body of water, but one that is beginning to temper that environment as you arrive and hopefully experience this dialogue of the idea of what it means to create a place of diplomacy where that respect for our relationship with India could come into focus. And so that leads to a project that is very much in our hearts because it's literally underway. We're just finishing the concept phase and moving into the environmental impact phase for reimagining La Brea. And all of you probably know about this, but maybe haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the fact that the origins of LA, which we think of a city which is desperate to get to the future, is one that has had this sort of million years in the making through the asphaltic tar that you could see bubbling out. It's a phenomena that won't go away. It's truly alive. Yet what that tar did was as it fully preserved a whole epoch primarily focused around the Pleistocene era of now sort of a whole set of species that are lost through extinction. And so if you think about LA, in many ways, LA wouldn't have happened without what in many ways we see coming from the tar pits, the whole notion of the roads, fortification, but it was in many ways this kind of story or fiction, and here it is, kind of amazing that it's 98 years since George Hancock donated the land to say that whatever came out of the ground, whatever fossils were here, needed to be preserved and made available to the citizens in Los Angeles. Of course, this is LA, so this is a fictional story of the mammoths and mastodons that all got stuck in the tar, couldn't come out, and that's why they've been preserved for our learning. And yet what's interesting is that 363 days a year, there is active paleontological work going on this site. This is not just a museum that's gathered some lovely things in the Page Museum to show, but they've come from this site, and the history that they've revealed is literally unfolding every single day. Now, what they have is well beyond what they can exhibit, and you can start to see here, this is really some of the collections that they have. I mean, it's the coolest space you've ever seen. And yet, you might not know how cool it is if you look at the outside from the corner of Curzon and Wilshire Boulevard. I mean, this is a miracle mile. So one of the questions that we had is if they've got active science happening throughout the year, they've got this museum, which in many ways has some very special qualities of almost being a kind of brutalist icon in LA, buried under a berm, concealing that history. And then you have this kind of sense of education and community that needs to be brought together. So we started to think about what time might look like and what the culture of LA has been. And as these were brought together, we started to think about where they came from and where they are through the powers of 10 that actually locate this kind of cultural corridor right here on Wilshire, and start to look closely at this strange remnant of 12 acres remaining from this much larger site, which, as you know, the recently opened Academy, LACMA underway, anchors this one side. But it's an odd place. I mean, it's filled with latent opportunities. You've got all the kind of excavations that are very active in one area. You've got the kind of cultural green because it is a public park, and this is a city that's starved for public greens. And you've got this strange phenomena of the lake pit in many ways. So we started to think about these latent opportunities of active research and excavation as one kind of identity. And I would argue that you should never design with a bubble diagram, but we started to do that. We just started to say, okay, where's research going, And then here's where the community comes together, both through the kind of cultural artifact of the Page Museum, but also the green, where, by the way, there's soccer games. And so then this kind of strange kind of spectacle of the lake pit, which you could start to see here, also being used in movies, and apparently there's a new series called La Brea, which apparently is not incredibly well linked to science. So we heard today when we were working with our client at Tar Pits. I don't know if you all have seen it. But if we started to think about these trio of elements, they're all really important. If you could enter this experience anywhere to learn about science, maybe we could begin with research and revelation. Maybe it's about community and culture. Maybe it's about the kind of spectacle that is a show on La Brea's sort of southeast face. But maybe it's all about allowing these loops of 1 kilometer to actually put into focus and behave like lenses to reveal the different, really extraordinary aspects of what this makes, what this happens. So those latent opportunities become the loops, and then they bring into focus then the kind of the Pleistocene, the Holocene, the Anthropocene, and we can begin to understand all of them are really in relation to one another, all because of one another, and you could start to see the Zumthor-LACMA building in many ways having a relaxed dialogue with this site in a way that it could never have had. And you can see our addition extending into the other side. The other element that's interesting is that shade equity is a crucial and pressing issue here in LA. Climate change is making LA hotter and harder. And so we took the kind of the mesh of leaves and sticks that had concealed the tar that brought the animals to get trapped in there. It was that sort of camouflage that we've elevated and lifted off, if you will, to become these canopies, to rethink the notion of what the walls or barriers that keep people out, to think about they might become portals, and to think about those kind of canopies to protect science and research and actually open up to the community, and that kind of liminal sharing of being both protecting those who are researching and those who are visiting to create one space that they can both share through this canopy now of that debris recast. But in many ways, actually, the real question was, how could you keep the museum operational while you do an expansion? And so we very simply said, why not literally shape a space for the community and allow it to be both the Page Museum and the expansion to be connected, but not undo, but allow us to actually reveal the very hidden treasures of their collection and allow that back of house, if you will, to reveal the collection rather to keep it hidden through this new drum of exhibition. But some of you may know, the Page Museum was the pioneering museum to actually reveal their research and labs to the public space. And so we're giving them even greater space now to actually reveal that as actively important as the collection itself. So you can start to see what that means now as you start to see it come together. There is this sense that it is at once literally lifting the lid of that topography that had concealed the collection to open onto something that now can tell new fictions. And you can start to see that we will be able to gather on the lawn to see a kind of a narrative that can unfold in film of what the Pleistocene past has been in this city in a hurry to get to its future. And here you can see the kind of bridge over the lake pit now. Normally something you could never get to or access, you can now actually cross that lake pit past that kind of spectacle of fiction on your right and look to a new unfolding and connective tissue to the museum beyond. So this last project is the Hunters Point South Waterfront Park. And I conclude with this one because in many ways the kind of test of climate change has been what has defined the definition of this leftover space that had been an industrial part of the past on Newtown Creek and on the East River. And when we were invited to think about and rethink what this could be, we were told it was an infrastructural project under the aegis of Arup to actually both take the contamination out, create a new map for a new affordable housing community, which will be the largest that New York has had since the 70s. But we had this weird perimeter of land, and most of the waterfront parks were pretty clean and pretty strong edge. It also had topography, which is another weird thing because they were asking for basketball courts and other things that want to be flat. So we started to think about it, but then of course Hurricane Sandy sort of brought into attention this question of flooding, and this question of topography became something that could be advantageous. Our query with Arup and TB Abalzi was to say, can we actually not so much resist and fortify, but can we fortify but accept and welcome the kind of wetness that is inevitable? And so you can start to see the design here, a kind of a loop that unfolds, leverages the perimeter, but also welcomes in water temporarily and actually creates new wetlands. So you can see it's truly kind of an infrastructural obligation that transforms, looks out to the city at once a playing field, a solar canopy here that gathers water and gathers energy, something that actually is in fact a hard-working piece of infrastructure to protect this playing field, a new beach, a kind of a tapestry, if you will, that allows recreation to occur in the first phase where everything was flat. But where it was topographically charged, we thought, why not create a very passive place? We knew we were going to be creating about an acre of wetlands, and yet the question was, could we have something that truly leverages and lifts off that whole top topography nearly 20 feet above the water? And we were sort of, looking at boats, the Intrepid on the West Side Highway, and just thinking about the kind of prospect of feeling that you're elevated and floating over the water, and did these sketches to start to think about how we could actually craft that. And working with Arup to come up with the engineering that was effectively creating a prefabricated piece in the Northeast. This could be brought down, and these steel plates were then crafted, hoisted into place, and in many ways, rather instantaneously, gave the opportunity for liftoff and landing to take place. And yet it was a subsurface here, the kind of carving of the earth to protect, allowing this almost medieval fortified zigzag walkway to protect new wetlands so that they could actually thrive because of the tidal change that goes up 6 feet and down 6 feet every single day, and that actually nourishes this water's edge. And so you could see in our mind, it was really this query is, can we have liftoff and landing at the same time? Can we, in fact, welcome the temporal flooding that we know is inevitable and happening, and maybe even get that sense that walking on water can actually happen in this perimeter condition. So again, you can start to see the unfolding, the unpacking, the unfurling, the sense that there's an intimacy with the water's edge, a sense of magic when we break free and create an island through the carving back for more wetlands. Sense of that island and the horizon beyond having magic, still accommodating the infrastructural obligations of bikes and roadways, and yet looking for something that is out of touch and out of sight, that if we can actually start to see is one where the kind of welcome to the community, particularly with the pandemic, has been one of those resources where we realize that our open space and our infrastructure and our public destinations, now more than ever, with the kind of social isolation, this is the local gym, there is that sense that we can perhaps feel closer as a community, especially at a time when our social and environmental kind of structures are slowly eroding. Maybe we welcome that change, maybe we welcome that softness, so that in fact we can have both. So thank you so much.